pops up about going live or whatever that you might have to hit on
Just
your
hit
screen.
OK.
Yeah,
Okay.
just hit, yeah, just hit
Yeah,
OK.
yeah,
I
yeah,
did that.
yeah, just did.
Okay, perfect. All right, we're live on
Sometimes you can
YouTube.
tell, sometimes you can't. I can't, this is the stupid thing. I can, whatever I do is I can't tell if we're live or not.
No, YouTube's got like a weird
There it is.
algorithm
I got
there.
my volume
So,
down though. Here we go. All right.
all
Okay.
right.
Now it's official. Okay.
Apparently there's one person watching right now.
Oh,
Some hardy souls. So we'll get going
Yeah.
here in a bit. So you guys been
Yeah.
okay? I thought the thing we did the other day with you guys was great. That was a
Yeah,
lot of
that
fun.
was really good.
oh yeah, enjoyed it very much. Mare, is your name Mary or Mare?
So my
What do you
name
go
is
by?
Mary.
My
Mary
name
Okay.
Margaret.
is.
Mary Margaret's
My
actually
name
my
is.
first name.
Okay.
But Mare is my nickname. That's what my
Oh,
dad calls me
okay.
that. So
Yeah.
that's but
Yeah,
yeah,
I was
it's
horrified the next day because I got up and I saw your Facebook name because you said,
yep.
"Hey, thanks for having me on, whatever." And it was Mare, and I had put Mary there. And
Oh,
oh my
don't
gosh, I got her
worry.
name
No,
wrong.
don't. You didn't get my you got my
Oh,
name right.
yeah, John,
Yeah.
she was devastated.
I would be horrified. Well, as a journalist, you're horrified when you get a name wrong.
It's
And
okay.
thankfully on Facebook we could
Hey,
change
since
that.
Yeah.
since since Mayor or Mary changed this, I'm glad that she changed the name because John uses my wife's Zoom account, and we
Yes.
got on. It normally says Colleen McMillan.
Yeah.
So thank you, Mary, for changing him to John
Yes.
Pax.
Definitely.
Yes. Yes.
Yep.
Oh
That's pretty
yeah.
cool.
Wow, you did that. That's really
Yeah,
cool. Thank you. I
Yeah.
just saw that. Wow,
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
So,
awesome.
Yeah.
so for those people jumping on, and so these are our friends from Antietam Podcasts. The great Tom McMillan and John Banks are joining us, and they are the gurus, I would say, in the podcasting world for Antietam. They know their stuff, and
Mhm.
both are published authors, which are great. And so they're joining us today. This I don't know if you know this, Mary, but it's Antietam anniversary. 163 was yesterday, so we figured why not do a live, bring these guys on, and just kind of talk about whatever pops into our heads. So yes, it's cool that you guys are on with us.
Thanks for
Yeah.
having us. This is
Yeah, we had a
awesome.
great. You guys were just on our podcast, so
Yeah.
it's great to do this.
Yeah, well, we're happy to have you join us for our live stream. We are definitely going to have you guys on some time to record an actual episode with us too. There's a few people on here. According, we have our friend Frank on here from California, and he says, "Happy 162nd Chickamauga," which makes me happy. And he also said that Frank is great with the historical facts. He said General Mansfield died 163 years ago today.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know him well.
He certainly did. Well, I have a feeling we're going to be talking about old Joe Mansfield here in a little while. But Antietam is a great battle. I like to say it started with the P that launched 23,110 casualties. Right, going back to Walter Humphreys, rather, of the Company E, the Second U.S. Sharpshooters, and he gets up in the middle of the night, early in the 17th, and he crosses Hagerstown Road. He's got to relieve himself, and he hears the distant sound of cannon by Asher Garber up on Nicodemus Heights rolling in. And he runs back and he's going to tell Lieutenant Edwin Hobbs, his boss, "Hey, I think I hear cannons. Wake everybody up." They get everybody up in time to run until the cannons open up on them. So you want to talk about a fortunate, nature's calling. That's really how the Battle of Antietam started when you look at it. And you talk about, when you look at Scott Hartley's book, he talks about that. And this is one of those cool personal stories that come out of these battles. When you get beyond the X's and the O's and the blue lines and the red lines, and sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes these stories pop up.
Mhm.
I agree 100%, Darren. And I was in Wisconsin at the excellent Kenosha Civil War Museum. Hat tip to Doug Dahman up there, who runs a great museum. And I was one of four speakers, along with Jim Rosebrock of the Antietam Institute. He was there, also Alan Schmidt and Doug's dad, Dr. Gordon Dahman. And one of the points that I make, I can still see the slide that had up on the screen. The numbers that everybody talks about, 23,000 casualties, roughly 3,300, 3,400 dead on September 17th, and then many, many more afterward. But the number that has always mattered to me is one. And the personal stories one by one. And
Mm-hmm.
and I'm really love telling the stories of people like Henry Adams of the 16th Connecticut who fought in the 40-acre cornfield. And years ago, I worked at ESPN.
Note that we are only a few minutes into the podcast, and John has already
Yes,
mentioned the 40-acre
I have
cornfield.
to.
I
I'm
always
sorry.
I always
Well,
look at
time
the
it to see how quickly he gets to that.
look at the background image there, Tom. You see the 16th Connecticut
Yeah.
monument and the 40-acre cornfield. But years when I worked at ESPN, the treasured day that I have was Saturday because it was my lone off day, really. And what I would do is go down to the Connecticut State Archives, and they'd have this wonderful collection down there called the George Whitney Collection. And George Whitney was a veteran in the 16th Connecticut, and his mission after the war was to compile biographies of all the soldiers in the regiment. And the soldiers would write him notes and give him information, etc. Among the first notes that I found was from Henry Adams. And what struck me from his note was he wrote, and he was shot in the leg at Antietam. He lay on the battlefield for like 38, 40 hours until he was rescued. But he wrote, "Why did I not die?" And there are dozens and dozens of stories like that on the battlefield. And for me, that's what floats my boat, the individual stories of soldiers below the general rank, generally below the officer.
Yeah, and I think we all, as we all study these battles, we do study the generals because there's so much information in their letters and their papers
Yeah.
are there. But Hartwig really tries to point that out in his book, in both of his books, that it's a soldier's war. And as John knows, my favorite personal story is at Antietam is the guy who carved his name on the back of the Dunkard Church, Henry Winters, who was just a regular schmuck from the 89th New York. He was so unknown that despite the fact that he did that, and it's the only publicly available piece on the battlefield that you could see that someone has left behind, that they were there during the battle, was that no one knew who he was. Like my wife Colleen and I would volunteer there. We'd send people around the back, and especially kids, families would love to see this name of this Civil War soldier who carved his name. And we started to ask Keith Snyder and the Rangers. No one knew. They knew he was in the 89th New York. That was it. We asked the great names, Tom Clemens and Dennis Fry and John Schultz and a bunch of the guys, and no one really knew who he was. So that started, how folks like us are. That started Colleen and I on this deep dive into who the heck Henry Winters was. And we found, a fair amount of information. He didn't write very much, as most of these guys didn't. He was one of these guys who was a farmer. He left for 4 years to fight the Civil War, and he went back and became a farmer and a painter, and didn't think he did anything spectacular, just fought in the war. And so we don't have a lot of their recollections, but I always go back, every time I volunteer, I go back and I pat that windowsill and say, Henry, someone's remembering you.
I was doing my thing at Dunkard Church about 2 weeks ago, and one of the Rangers came in with this huge, gigantic school group, bunch of 30 heathens, just all came in. And they filled the whole thing. And so I told the whole story of Ellen Boyer and about the Moomas, the whole deal about the Dunkard Church. And I told them the story about Winters. And I told him, make sure you go outside now and you go see the initials. And this kid walks up, he goes, "Can I carve my initials in there too?" I'm like, go,
Oh my
no.
gosh.
I'm like,
No.
you're going to get a shot out of a cannon. I go, no. I go, no, you cannot carve your initials, but at least they were excited to go see it.
Yeah.
But that's right though. It's these stories when you tell the 148 PA, that picture of them all in front of the Dunkard Church, and this debate, it was 1888 or 1904. We have fun with that, but they all come back and they tell these stories, and you're looking at the faces of these men, and it's hard not to get so overwhelmed with just the coolness of it all. And people, a lot of people here are Gettysburg people who do our thing here. And you realize the fact that you've got 6 corps at the Union, and not one corps commander at Gettysburg out of the 7 was a corps commander at Antietam. And people sometimes are stunned at how close the battles were as far as time. And it just goes to show how the turnover was.
It's 9 months apart, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. Tom talks about that a lot. These battles weren't fought in a vacuum, and you have to almost take the 20,000 foot view of these places. But Darren and Mayor and Tom, every time I go to Antietam, it's surreal for me because it's I think You mean this 18-year-old kid from Massachusetts is going to stick a 1 ounce piece of lead down a pipe and he's going to ignite it and fire it into the 17-year-old kid from Georgia up on that hill? Like, that's crazy. And every time I walk that field, I'm thinking like, is this where Alonzo Maynard of the 11th Connecticut was placed aside at Burnside Bridge by the surgeon and put aside to die? He was riddled with gunfire, and he
Mhm.
ended up living to like his early 50s. And is this where, in that archive that I was just talking to you about, found a map that a post-war map that had an X on it in the 40-acre cornfield that showed where Captain Samuel Brown, a teacher from Massachusetts who moved to Connecticut, it showed where they found his body in relation to the 16th Connecticut Monument. Every time I'm walking the ground there, I'm wondering like whose spirit am I trampling upon?
Well, it's you mentioned Massachusetts. It's easy to think about, Wilder Dwight, the second mass. He writes that famous letter. Anybody who studies Antietam knows about his famous letter, and that's kind of the mainstream ones, the top level ones. But as you guys know, as you get deep into this, start peeling the levels out of the onion. There's thousands of these guys. There's thousands of them and they're all waiting to be discovered in one way, shape, or form on both sides.
Mhm. I would imagine there's some that haven't been discovered yet, that maybe letters in somebody's attic or whatever, and that's what's cool about studying this. I know for me, like, Antietam is one of my favorite battlefields to visit, and I mean, just to, you know, because I am like I study more Western theater, it reminds me in some ways of Chickamauga, because Chickamauga and Antietam, there's not really any statues to generals on either battlefield. It is both battlefields have been made by the soldiers. Um, there's the closest soldier or the closest general statue at Chickamauga is in Ringgold Gap, and it's for Patrick Cleburne for fighting at the Battle of
Mhm.
Ringgold. And I find that so like just fascinating how
Yep.
different it is from Gettysburg, and that Antietam is that way as well, that you can go there and there's just these monuments to the guys who fought.
Well,
Um,
and part of that is fascinating to me because people come back and talk about how pristine it looks,
mhm,
and yet most of that battlefield, the NPS National Park Service only got it in the 1990s.
mhm,
It was farmed, most of it was farmed from 1862 into the 1990s. That's why it looks like farmland. It was farmland. And a lot of those early monuments, the soldiers had to strike deals with the farmers to buy a little plot of land on their farm to put up a monument. So the early ones were kind of constructed that way. And as for people who've been coming to Antietam for a long time, it's really been a change in experience from the 60s and on to where your access and where you went. So it's a humble battlefield that way. And I think the Civil War nerd really loves it.
mhm.
We always have the Antietam people make fun of Gettysburg, and the Gettysburg people make fun of Antietam. And really,
No.
yeah.
And the Western theater people are making fun of the
By the
Eastern
East,
theater.
yeah, we always have to do that. It's like sports. You have to, but they're so, in Darren, Mary, you and I, when we live a couple blocks apart at Gettysburg, and we love it here too. But what I do say to people, well, yeah, but Gettysburg gets more visitation because there are more things for families to do.
Well,
There are
exactly.
McDonald's, but at Antietam for the real student. I think it's the one battlefield that if the soldiers came back, it's the one they would most recognize because it still looks pretty much the way it would have looked on September 16th,
Yeah,
1862.
there's no doubt. And unlike Gettysburg, there are vital parts of Antietam battlefield, that are still privately owned. Nicodemus Heights comes to mind,
Yeah.
where such a substantial part of what Jeb Stuart's artillery was, and it's an important where the first shots were fired is private property right now. Poffenberger still owns part of on the Northwoods,
And
and so you
plus,
slow,
I, I'm sorry to interrupt there. That's a really good point. Apologies for interrupting, but
I'll let it go.
no,
No, it happens on here.
no, I'm so excited that we're talking Antietam the day after the anniversary. So apologies, but the Henry Rohrbach farm, And back beyond that, where the Ninth Corps camp is all it's private property, and the Henry Rohrbach farm, namesake of the Rohrbach Bridge slash Burnside
Burnside
Bridge, the,
Bridge.
the Henry Rohrbach farm was a key Ninth Corps hospital back there, and it's very, very, very seldom visited, privately
Yeah,
owned.
and Nicodemus Heights and Hauser Ridge, there are pieces of that too. You could drive the road, but it's private property. And one thing, John and I both members of the Antietam Institute, and at one of the conference, they have spring and fall conferences. One of them a few years ago, we got access to Nicodemus Heights. It's still an active farm with
Yeah.
crops and cattle, but the guy came out, the old farmer came out, and he had his truck open, and he had all these items that he had recovered from the battlefield, and gave a nice little talk and walked around with us. And I can tell you, it's one of those things, and you'll know this, until you get up there, you can't appreciate the position. You can
Mhm.
look at it from the battlefield, it's kind of covered by trees. You have a completely different perspective when you get up there. So sometimes we do, through the organizations we belong to, have access to these special places. And it really gives you a unique and kind of might change your view of what happened there.
Tom, back when I was a cub journalist many, 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 many years ago, I got to know the Culler family, Paul and his wife, and they owned Miller's Cornfield, had farmed it since the late 1940s. And I still remember pulling up, I was doing a story on, I was this dumb cub reporter, and I don't even know if I knew how to pronounce Antietam at the time. But they had as I pull up to the Miller farmhouse, which, we all know, everybody, all the listeners and viewers know, have seen the famous images of the farmhouse. But I pull up and they had a table there, standard kitchen table out on the driveway, and it was just covered with stuff that they had found over the years, bullets and pieces of rifle and artillery fragments. And that's what like really supercharged my interest in Antietam a long time ago. So
John, didn't you tell me of a friend? And John Darren Mary has this incredible ability to go up and rap on somebody's door, which I would never do. And not only do they answer, but they like him, and they're almost always connected to the Civil War. His stories are incredible. The one about the guy who had the live piece of, or he thought he might have
yeah,
had a live piece of Civil War. I
yeah.
love that story.
I was gonna, when I was in Kenosha, I felt sometimes I feel rushed in my talks, and I had to skip this story. And I knew Earl Roulette and his wife Annabelle. And Earl Roulette was the great grandson, I believe I have that right, of William Roulette, who owned the Roulette farm that's adjacent to Bloody Lane. And Earl was like in his early 80s at the time. He had lived in Sharpsburg, I believe, all his life. He was a farmer, and he was the nicest man. And he had this high-pitched voice. And he invites me into his house right on the main street in Sharpsburg, and it was almost directly across from Lee's headquarters. Mayor and Darren, you've probably seen the headquarters site, right? It's along
Yep.
the road to Shepherdstown, and there's a little historical marker there. It's kind of it's a cool little spot.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, I go over to his house one morning, and he's a typical farmer of that era. It was springtime. It was probably like, I don't know, 60 degrees out. He had the temperature turned way up, and he'd get up at like 4 a.m. So I'd come over there, and Annabelle is rocking in the chair in the living room, and Earl is pulling out this stuff that's like amazing. He goes, "Here's a ring. My ancestors pulled this off from a fallen soldier in Antietam Creek." And I posted this to my blog a long time ago. And then he would pull out an image of Nancy Camel, who was the freed slave. What's the term? Manumitted?
Yeah, she was manumitted. Yeah.
Manumitted. And she worked for William Roulette. And it was just amazing, all the stuff he had. And then he calls me out back, and I looked, he had 2 ammunition crates that were pulled off the battlefield and handed down through his family until they got to Earl. And I'm looking at, it had the bent bayonets, all right, that could have been used to pull bodies off the field. But I look into the ammunition crate, and there's what looked like to me unexploded ordnance. And I go, Earl, have these things been deactivated yet? And again, he had this high-pitched voice. He'd go, oh, no. The next time you come see me, the buzzards may be circling around me. And it
Oh
was
my
just,
gosh.
but those people are such great reservoirs of
Mhm.
information. And now I think all that stuff is with the got donated to the National Park Service.
I
So
mean, people who who don't know the fine details. William Roulette was 37 years old. He lived in the Roulette farm. He had some slaves that he owned. He was a unionist, but he had 6 slaves with him, and he refused to leave his farm. He stayed at the battle, and as the troops are marching back, 130th PA, they're walking down the path heading towards the sunken road. He's out there cheering them on, yelling, almost like high fiving, like as a coach going on in the field. So he's a character. Um, and his house is still pristine. You can still go to it today, and you can go see all the outcroppings, the outbuildings. But he's one of the many characters as you study the Battle of Antietam that you kind of get to know. And they're all farm families, from Poffenburgers to the Roulettes to the Moomas to all of them, and they all have different stories to tell. The Pipers, and that's what's great about it. The Roarbacks is a lot of these people, as you just hinted at, a lot of them are still in town, so you could go to sit at Bender's when they get their liquor license back. We can go back.
what?
Yeah, they
They
lost
lost
their
their
liquor
liquor license?
Vendors
again.
lost their liquor license, the
Yeah, they
one
lost it
bar in
again.
town.
So,
Is this breaking news, Darren?
I
I'm
heard
sounding like a
my
roulette. I'm
my
sorry.
source is close to Sharpsburg said they've lost it temporarily. So there we go.
Oh,
So when
interesting.
they get that back, we'll head back, and
Yes.
there's a good chance you'll sit in one of these places, and you'll talk to these people. They'll
Yes.
tell you the stories about how after the battle, how the Confederates and the Unions, they treated the townspeople, and just how they were. And it's like Gettysburg but smaller. And so it's a
Mhm.
little more. It's more of a town. It's more homey. And just like here in Gettysburg, PA, there are families who still there who still tell those great stories. You get to talk to these family stories that come down the lines.
Yeah, until for the longest time, one of the maintenance guys at the battlefield was Ike Muma.
Mm-hmm.
There you have, working at the battlefield.
Does he still work there, Tom, or did he
I
retire?
don't think so. I don't, I've lost track, but I was always just fascinated by that name and that story, that in the 21st century, this was happening. And you do have, and our friend Dennis Fry, the icon from Harper's Ferry to Antietam, is a Poffenberger, is a descendant of the
Yep.
Poffenberger family. So you have a lot of people with those kinds of connections in town. It has a different kind of feel when you're there. And I think it's one of the reasons I find, I think John agrees with me, Antietam so welcoming. A
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
lot of places, not that they're unwelcoming, but there's a little rivalry and who knows more, and I know more
Yeah.
than you, and there's competition. That does not exist. One of the reasons Colleen and I volunteer at Antietam, it's they welcome you to do things like that.
Mhm.
You want to work with people like that.
I agree
I
with you. Go ahead, Mary. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just to say I definitely agree with that. It like everybody is always so welcoming and happy to answer whatever questions that you have. Like I talked to who is it over in the Westwoods? Is it
Jim
Buchanan?
Jim
Buchanan.
Buchanan, yeah.
Yes,
There.
I showed
There.
up there. Darren and I are there one day, and I show up, and of course I've got like my Howard University t-shirt on and my Howard hat, and I realize we're in the West Woods, and he starts talking about the West Woods and Howard, and here I am expecting it to go negative as it does at some sites because I've run into that before, but no, it was a very balanced, like positive view of Howard, and it was completely different than what has happened to me in Gettysburg.
And
It's
Jim's one of those
much
guys
different.
who'll tell the story because it's funny.
Yeah.
'Cause we're there, and he's like, oh, Howard, he ran the Philadelphia Monument. You can still imagine Willis Gorman and Napoleon Dana, and then here comes Otis Howard coming across that street, and he just tells the story the way he explains it. And then he stopped and he turned to he didn't turn to his left like he should. He kept going, and then he gets all excited telling the stories um, and not that against the battlefield, especially this one, but you're absolutely right. Antietam has more of a family feel of all the people who, like us, who volunteer, and the guides who work there, and our friends who are rangers. It's just such a welcoming place.
To me, it truly feels like 1862 underneath a bubble. Okay. In Gettysburg, you're going down the Emmitsburg Pike. Whoa, hey, there's a miniature golf place. Okay. You're not going to see that at Antietam. And to me, for those who want to travel back into time, I think at Antietam you can do that, and you can do it at Shiloh, and to a degree at Chickamauga. Is that your favorite battlefield, Mayor? Chickamauga?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, I can see why. It's a fascinating field.
Yeah.
But getting back to William Roulette, Darren, one thing I don't know if you know this, but when we lived in Connecticut, I was doing some research into some Connecticut soldiers, and William Roulette helped the family of Robert Hubbard, who was in the 14th Connecticut, recover Robert's body. He was killed by friendly fire at Antietam near Bloody Lane. And he wrote I mean, the compassion of this man really is amazing, because in the note, he writes the body's on the way, blah, blah, blah. And by the way, we've had tragedy, and I'm paraphrasing, had tragedy in our family too. Their daughter, Carrie Mae, who I think was 2 years old, died in the weeks after the battle. Obviously, you have all this disease and pestilence and dead soldiers and groundwater polluted and dead horses, and we can presume that this may have caused her death. So it's really, this tragedy just didn't affect soldiers and their families. It really crushed Sharpsburg for quite a long time.
Mm.
And talking so many personal stories come to your head. Sticking to the roulette farm, Nancy Camel was mentioned earlier, had been a slave, then was manumitted, but continued to work for the roulettes as a paid employee and lived at that place and took care of the roulette children. And when she died, she left part of her money to the roulette children. This is a lady who had been a slave on this farm, and yet she took care of those kids, and it was like they were her own kids. And she was a member of a Dunker church a few miles north of the battlefield, and is buried in a cemetery up there. So I always like to tell stories like that too. I think I get more questions at Antietam than ever did at Gettysburg about the citizens, what happened. And I think you can see the farms. I mean, it looks like that farmland, and there's so many, what happened to those folks. And I think people are interested in those stories as in addition to the soldiers.
And I think people are surprised. I mean, Maryland was a border state that had slavery. I mean, Sharpsburg was 10% black. I mean, you had about 1,675 basically free men, about 1,450 slaves living at the same time. And so you had a lot of slave families there as well. So it's unlike Pennsylvania, that's one aspect of it that Gettysburg didn't have to deal with.
And the real irony is that Antietam, obviously the battle that led to the Emancipation Proclamation, and Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation 5 days later, but it only freed the enslaved people in the rebelling states, which meant it did not free the slaves in Maryland. So even though the victory was in Maryland and it happened in Maryland, it was not until Maryland redid its constitution in 1864 that those enslaved people, still enslaved in Sharpsburg, got their freedom. Just a remarkable kind of one of those under the radar stories that just makes you shake your head, but is part of the mosaic of the battle on the battlefield.
And that's one of the big parts about Antietam is the Emancipation Proclamation aspect of it. And when you read some of the documents that came out with McClellan afterwards, there was that whole thing with Major John Key. I mean, people may or not that whole story, but it just eventually what happens is McClellan basically is going to basically play the game. He's going to play along and say, we have to do what the government wants. He doesn't agree with it. But then he has that line where he says, but don't forget this. Basically, there's an election coming up. So he kind of twists the knife a little bit. But some of that initial politics that came out specifically that broke down Democrat versus Republican right down the lines. I mean, McClellan thought it was going to destroy the army, and it just never did. But as soon as the battle ends, it instantly turns into a real political football right off the top. And people always talk about, oh, we should have chased them down to Virginia, blah, blah, blah. But people don't always remember that aspect of that initial emancipation, that the preliminary when it came out. It didn't come out till January, but it came out right after the battle. how that was going to affect as far as the soldiers go. And I think depending on who you read, it was the greatest thing in the world or the worst thing in the world, but it broke virtually exactly on party lines.
Darren, speaking of Lincoln, Antietam is I can feel his presence there. I really can. And he visited the troops down in Harper's Ferry. He comes from Washington in early October 1862. He gets to Harper's Ferry, reviews some troops. He travels the same road that John Brown did en route to Harper's Ferry. He meets with Burnside at Mill Spring Road. I think I have that right. And then eventually he goes out and he meets with Little Mac, and then he meets with him and the staff out at the Stephen Grove Farm. And for people unfamiliar with the Stephen Grove Farm, you'll remember the Alexander Gardner image of Lincoln with McClellan and his staff. That was taken at the Stephen Grove Farm, which is for sale for $3.3 million. That, the farmhouse, which is beautiful, and the surrounding 10 acres. Much of the rest of the ground's under easement. But every time I travel from holding my ice cream that I got at Nutter's, drive over to Shepherdstown and then look to my left at the Stephen Grove Farm, that's where Lincoln was. That's where he reviewed troops. That's where he met Little Mac. That's where perhaps the most famous photo of the Civil War was taken, arguably. And that's where I feel Lincoln there. I can feel him.
That's
So
3.5 million.
something like that. I think if we combine our funds, we still wouldn't.
Wow, if only I had some of that.
Wouldn't even come
If I had
close.
some of that big author money, I could probably buy that.
Don't look at Tom and don't look at me. Look at Tom, but don't look at me.
Gotta win that Powerball.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
better be. But there is, and there's some great books about Antietam, but there are some really good little books that aren't really
Yes.
well known that I have been
Yes.
fascinated with. One of those to this topic is called 4 Days in September.
Yes.
It's written by the great John Schilt, who's been
Yes.
doing tours at Gettysburg for about 70 years.
Yes.
His grandmother would tell him stories of the soldiers. And it focused on just on those 4 days. And there were things in there I read that I'd never read anywhere else, because John just, when everybody's writing these big sweeping stories of the battle, they don't necessarily get into every nook and cranny. And John did it. I'm fascinated by that visit in those 4 days. And I agree. I feel Lincoln, and he has quotes from the family and those little things. The other book that isn't on the top of everybody's reading list that I think you had referred to earlier, a little bit in the letters, is McClellan's Civil War Papers, edited by Stephen Sears. Which Stephen
I have
Sears,
that.
tremendous writer, did the Landscape Turned Red. Really, it's beautifully written. He really is anti-McClellan, so you have to know that going in. But the letters, when you read what McClellan was writing, to your point, Darren, you can really follow and see how it isn't this nice, neat little story all the time, and everybody had their own opinions. And McClellan, I guess he knew most of them were private letters to his wife, but I guess he knew at some point they would become public. Nonetheless, you really see, people didn't know some of those feelings at the time. They might have been on a guest. We always have to remember that too, that those letters were not public at that time.
That's
It
what
wasn't
I
until
always
years
tell.
later.
That's what I always tell people when they're like, "Oh, McClellan insulted people in his letters." I'm like, "Tell me who didn't? He's writing them to his wife. That's like his kind of sounding board that he's got to write to people." So, I mean, Abraham Lincoln said the same, like similar things about people as well. They all did, and that's what we do as humans. There are a couple questions here that I wanted to get to. Estella was wondering if there is a trail available to walk along Antietam Creek.
Well, you can walk along the Stavely Ford. You can walk down there,
Yes.
and that's a good one because you can park pretty much with a Burnside bridges, and you can walk by the Georgia sharpshooter nest. And you can walk all the way down to Snavely's Ford. That's the only one I really know of as far as a path. You can walk along on the other side where like the 11th Connecticut was. But the one, if you walk to Snavely, that's a good path. That's a really, really good
That
one.
is, you really feel it. And at one of the Antietam Institute events, John was there with me. We did a tour down there with the homeowner who took us out there on private property. We're down there. John was flying his drone. He was a kid in the
Oops.
candy store, but it was
With permission.
with permission.
With permission.
It was private. It was private land. It wasn't Park Service
With
land.
permission.
But again, that's part of the, sometimes when you join these organizations, you get to places, especially at a place like Antietam, where everything isn't part of the park, but you can get the man who owned the house was very nice and had a lot of information and helped us out. But yeah, that you can take a pretty good journey, Stella, down the Snavely Ford path. It's worthwhile. And especially,
Stella,
this time of year, the leaves are coming down. You really can see a lot.
I mean, it's a little bit of a walk. It's not a milk run. It's going to take you a little bit, but it's a beautiful walk.
Oh yes.
We were talking the other day when we were on you guys' thing talking about the final assault approach. That one, you walk up to walk towards the branch monuments, and you can walk that way. And there's so many cool places. When people go to Antietam, they tend to go to the Dunker Church. They tend to go to the cornfield. They go to the Westwoods. They'll go to Sunken Road, they'll go to Burnside Bridge, and that's kind of what they do. They follow the car, but there are so many cool places that you can walk. And we were saying today, my favorite place is that area, just a little bit south of west of the Burnside Bridge, where you can walk towards that auto farm, and you can walk up that hill, and it's a pristine, it's beautiful, and it's such a great story. You can imagine Maxie Gregg, South Carolinians coming out of the corn. You can picture so much because it's a gorgeous battlefield. It is by far my favorite place in the battlefield.
And the staff there has done a great job with trails. It's as good a network of trails on any battlefield anywhere. The one most recently opened last year, I believe, was the Piper Farm Trail. But you really can get a sense of the battlefield by walking those trails and experiencing that way. And to the point about the Burnside Bridge, I often, Darren and Mary, as you know, and John, as I volunteer at the Burnside Bridge, and a lot of folks do end their tour there. It's a long day, and they think that's where the battle ended. It is an iconic piece. It's why I volunteered there. I love the Burnside Bridge. But they always say, wow, how many casualties were there here? And I'll say, there were only about 600 here. Now, if you're one of those 600, that's a lot. But in context of Civil War, that only 600, there are 3,000 in the final attack. And they're stunned by that because a lot of folks who come for the first time don't realize it didn't end there. And the much bloodier fighting was through the area in and around the 40-acre cornfield as they tried to drive towards Sharpsburg.
Well, Tom, as the old NPS historian, RIP Ed Bars used to say, if you want to understand a battlefield, you have to walk the ground.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, follow up on, as Darren noted, there are so many cool trails there to walk. You can't just see this battlefield from your car. You got to get out.
Exactly.
And walk from the North Woods over to the visitor center, and just the 40-acre cornfield. When I first walked back there, like, my wife's from Iowa, and I've seen Iowa cornfields, and they're flat relatively. That's not a flat cornfield.
No.
The farmer Otto, it was actually Sherrick's 40-acre cornfield. It was owned by Joseph Sherrick.
Yeah.
And it's rolling terrain, and every time I'm there, I try to imagine the corn back in 1862 was spaced out wider than cornfields are today. And I try to imagine, the Rhode Island troops on the left, the Green Connecticut troops next to them, and the 8th Connecticut veteran troops going up towards Harper's Ferry Road. And it's just a great scene.
You can have some fun though, because people are like, where's the cornfield? I'm like, which one? The one they fought at. Well, which one?
Totally.
And it's funny because people think of Miller's cornfield. There's obviously Piper's cornfield, there's Sherrick's cornfield, there's all these different places. But Sherrick's is great, to your point, because me personally, that's where a lot of the New Englanders were, right?
Yes.
No, you mentioned the 4th Road, you mentioned the 8th and the 16th Connecticut, and it's the 4th Rhode Island, and so you can go there and you can see, not people who I'm not from I'm from Mass, but you still resonate with certain type of people in certain places, especially when they're not visited. You feel like you have an obligation to go hike out to the 4th Rhode Island because no one gets out there. Nobody does.
We had, as you know, we're doing this on September 18th. Yesterday was the 163rd anniversary. I was lucky enough to go down, maybe because I'm lucky a little bit given the weather, to go
Yeah,
down
the
there
rain.
for the battle anniversary. And they always do something in the cornfield about sunrise, about 6 a.m. But they did a 7-hour full day battle hike yesterday, the entire battle, 4 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon. It rained almost the whole way. The only hour that it didn't rain was the hour we broke for lunch, naturally. But but there were about 75 people there, and people stuck it out the whole way, as we were joking a little bit. And once you're wet, you're wet. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But there's, Brian and Olivia and Jenna and Mark did such a great job of telling the story. And there's still something for those of us who love it of being on the ground on the anniversary at the time. You're at 163 years ago. Right now, this happened here, and that's always moved me at Antietam, Gettysburg, wherever. And it was a great experience to do that. If anybody has a chance to do that in the future, make a little trip out there for the anniversary. It is very well worth it.
Yeah. And for the Gettysburg people, there's a lot of, parallels. I mean, 11 PA, Richard Coulter with Sally, it was there too. It's cool stories. The 90th Pennsylvania has got that really great monument they have there. People are
A hot place.
Right. That's what Horatio Howell, the chaplain of the 90th PA, he was the one who was shot on the steps of the Lutheran Seminary and Lutheran Church here in Gettysburg. So same regiment, just 9 months later. So you can begin to look at some of these guys and you can see how the regiments, how they've grown. Like we said at the beginning, now one corps commander out of the 7 here was one of the 6 at Antietam because of a million different reasons. But you get to study these guys, and you see the monuments at Antietam, and you realize what they had here, and you could just imagine their experiences going from Sharpsburg to Gettysburg in that 9 months, and just being a fly on the wall and just experience what these guys lived through.
And I think a flaw of all of us who studied the Civil War, and I fell into this early, is sometimes we just study one battle. And your perspective of the 4 years is that battle, that day, or that's, in my case, those 3 days at Gettysburg. And then you you reach out and you start doing things like Antietam. And to your point, it's 9 months apart. It's the same guys, the same units, but different commanders. Look how the Army changed, how the commanders moved up or were wounded or killed or whatever.
Yep.
But the foot soldiers were the same. The units were the same. And it struck me, not only did the commanders get different roles, but the soldiers constantly had to deal and learn under different commanders who had different capabilities, different styles. We tend to forget that when we just focus on one battle, and it was quite the mosaic. And the other day, Colleen and I just did a tour over the weekend at Manassas, and Second Manassas is less than 3 weeks before the Battle of Antietam.
Yeah,
That's one thing that we recorded our episode about Harper's Ferry last night, and the one thing that I thought of in my research was like, you have Second Manassas being fought and disaster under Pope. And what is it, like just over 2 weeks later, Antietam is fought and McClellan's leading them. He's got very short window of having to get that army ready to fight and to bring up their morale again. And I like that was one thing that hit me when I was studying, just looking at the Maryland campaign and Harper's Ferry and all that. I was like, well, this guy is like,
well, and the people who rip on McClellan, forget that. Forget the fact that he has to take an army that's completely shattered. He's going to merge you with the Army of Virginia and the Army of the Potomac, put it together, one big thing. They're all beaten up. And then he's told, you've got to go out there. You got to push Lee out of Maryland. By the way, you got to protect Maryland, Baltimore and Washington. Oh, and by the way, Pinkerton says there's 87 million soldiers over there waiting for you. So when people want to rip on him, and I get it, for a lot, he deserves a lot of what he gets, but at the same time, put yourself in his shoes. We have 163 years of dissecting and analyzing every little thing these guys do. Just picture yourself. Go get yourself a ham sandwich. Go sit under a bee's nest. Hit it with a bat. Sit there and eat it. That's what these guys were doing in trying to make their decisions in real time. And I think people need to remember that and give these guys a little bit of a break. But again, it's easy to sit back and read and learn and read Sears, and he gets picking on everybody. But in real time, it's borderline miracle because people forget Lee was on a heater at that point. He was rolling. He was Vegas, at the craps table hitting every single time. And for him to get pushed back, it's a victory in itself. And he again, it's not a perfect victory, but at the same time, if you're at Vegas and you're betting on one of those two teams, you wouldn't be picking the Union. You wouldn't.
I think you're right. I think you're right. I really, I drill down to the individual soldiers and how they,
Mhm.
You look to your right and your buddy's shot and he's killed. And you look to your left, hey, there's your brother with a head wound. And just how they dealt with, granted, there were the Civil War soldier went through a lot of boredom. Okay. They're not fighting every day. There's been long periods of intense boredom. But when they had these major battles and you have hundreds and hundreds of soldiers wounded and thousands dead, like at Antietam, I always think about this one guy, Darren and Mayor and Tom, John Burnham, who was an adjutant in the 16th Connecticut, who his job after the battle was to gather the bodies of the dead and bury them on near the Otto farmhouse. We
Mhm.
think we know where that happened, and I dug into his pension records, and after the war he suffered from PTSD and was in an insane asylum. So I can't imagine how they dealt with that, you
Well,
know?
No,
I
they,
can't.
and I remember, Rufus Dawes he's
Yes.
at Antietam, and the one thing you read the beginning of his memoirs,
Yeah.
and he's all like, I'm gonna fight. He's really gung ho into it. And by the time you get to the end, he is a completely different person, and he's there at a cemetery and he's questioning why he's alive and his friends aren't. And that is a guy that just like completely changes as he's writing his memoirs and the wars
Well, he
going
Survivor's
on.
lost
guilt.
his
Yeah.
he lost his friend at
Yep.
Antietam,
Yeah,
Edwin
yeah.
Brown, I think it
Yeah.
was.
Brown, you're
Yeah.
right at the
Yeah.
fence. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then,
Pulling them out.
there's so many family stories. There's a story here that it's known but not well known, not well researched. I may work on a piece for the Antietam Journal if I get motivated. But with the Miller family, remembering Maryland was a border state. Maryland was a slave state. There were people who were pro-Union, people who were pro-Confederate. Now, most people in the West, there was a little more pro-Union feeling there. Nonetheless, there were pro-Confederate people. The Miller farm, David R. Miller's farm, his brother was in the Confederate Army, did not fight at Antietam, but was in the 2nd Virginia. If you go to Shepherdstown and go to the cemetery there, on Wood Cemetery, they list the local men who were in the Civil War. His name is listed with the 2nd Virginia.
Mhm.
Two of David Miller's sisters were married to Confederate soldiers. So he had a brother and two brothers-in-law who were in the Confederate Army. It's one of the reasons, and in Steve Cowley's great book, he had to really, when he was trying to get money back for the damage in his farm, he had to prove he was a pro-Union guy.
Mhm.
People in the family that were pro-Confederate, and helped him out that his dad, who actually owned the farm, was a War of 1812 veteran, but they had to deal with that. Imagine, I'm sure there's nothing written about it, but imagine before the war, the discussions at the dinner table, so to speak.
Oh yeah.
If you had those kinds of, just that one family that was, is famous to Antietam because their land was fought over by the troops.
Darren, can we give a mini shout out to the final battle of the Maryland campaign?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The Battle of
That's
right.
Shepherdstown?
We got to talk about
Yep.
that. I mean, we
Yep.
we certainly can. I mean, that's another one. Not Fitzjohn Porter's brightest day, certainly.
Mhm.
But I mean, for people who don't know that, some people think the 17th ends, they shake the hands, good game, good game, good game, they all go home. But I mean, the Maryland campaign didn't end there. I mean, Lee had to escape. He's gonna cross over the ford, and he is gonna get chased down primarily by infantry because the cavalry decides not to show up. They don't want to go, so it ends up being a little bit of a delay. But you've got that the poor corn regiments, exchange regiment, with the guns that don't work, fighting against this massive pushback by Jubal Early. And I think if you study the Battle of Shepherdstown, it's a really fascinating battle because it's so easy to be overshadowed. But when you look at that, it's for me, I think it puts a bow on it, as does Williamsport afterwards. But the Battle of Shepherdstown is certainly one that it's just a great study when you look at it, because again, it's the soldiers talked about, the remnants of Ball's Bluff, because if you've been to Shepherdstown, if you've been there, there are cliffs that go up, and they talked a lot about Leesburg, and a lot of the mass guys talk about having to climb down again down the cliffs, then cross the water while being shot to get back onto the Maryland side. And a lot of them, when you read some of the diaries, they say this is exactly like Ball's Bluff.
Well,
And
it's fascinating because along the Potomac River, River Road, there are the old kilns,
Mhm.
and one of the kilns there were where wounded and very frightened Union soldiers lay, and several of them were killed right in that arch of the lime kiln by friendly
Yeah.
artillery fire from the opposite side of the river. And one note about the Shepherdstown battlefield, thankfully, most of it has been saved recently from development. The ground, I've been up there, it's a beautiful field. It's
Mhm.
really gorgeous. And one of the great stories of the Civil War, Lemuel Crocker, an officer in the 118th Pennsylvania, he he disobeys orders, crosses the Potomac to bring wounded men across the
Right.
river, and he's confronted by a Confederate officer who asks him what he's doing and how long he's been in the army. And he says, only a month. And the officer, I believe, shakes his head and points them to a canoe or a boat along the
Yeah.
river that he can use. And he was foolhardy in doing it, but extremely brave in doing it. And Tom and I, when we had, I think Kevin Pollack, who's the real expert on the Battle of Shepherdstown, were at least I am touting him for the Congressional Medal of Honor. I can't vouch for Tom, but I think Lemuel Crocker is one of my heroes. So
He is. Another guy to talk to a lot is Tom Clemens about Shepherdstown,
yes,
and
yeah,
Matt Borders for that matter too. But
yeah.
get them going about it. But you're right. The 118, the Corn Exchange Regiment, they have a monument here at Gettysburg too, down by the loop they call it, right down where the Stony Hill connects as it heads towards towards the Peach Orchard in that area. But that's a great story, because you can just imagine this great wet behind the ears kid. He's like, I'm going to get these guys who are wounded. And the Confederates say, "What are you doing?" He's like, "All right, fine, whatever." And I think he actually had some of the Confederates help him too carry the boat down.
I believe so. I
If I
believe you're
remember,
right.
if I
Yeah.
remember correctly, he just said, "Go take the boat. These guys will help you take the boat down. Just we'll make sure no one shoots at you. Don't worry about it." And he
Well,
gets across. It's just a great story.
the thing about Crocker is I found he ended up living in Buffalo area, and I found his obit he died in like 1888 or whatever, 98. There's zero mention of his actions at Shepherdstown. And granted, this is not a big battle, okay? It was the final battle of the Maryland campaign, but to me, it was just an amazing slice of bravery there that really merits. Lemuel Crocker deserves to be more widely known than he
Mhm.
is. So
Yes. And it was great about him is he just didn't know what he didn't know yet. He just that's the great story about him. The 118th is a great story. It's one of those great regiments that you can study and you can read about. But there's so many great stories of all that the Maryland campaign. We tend to focus on just Antietam, but when you look at the whole thing from obviously Harper's Ferry, from Fox's, Turner's, and Crampton's Gap, all the way to Shepherdstown, and then to Williamsport, when they finally turned Jeb back. I mean, yeah, because people forget Lee wasn't done. He was going to just do a big U-turn. There was a U-turn, we call it, back in Massachusetts, and he was going to try to come back in Maryland. And this is where you got to give McClellan a little bit of credit. He kind of figured as much, and he put troops down in Williamsport to deny the crossing. And then Lee finally had to fall back and call it a day. So it's as you study these things, it's interesting to find that some of the people you thought were completely incompetent weren't, and vice versa.
And,
I mean,
and
you-
you're right there. A lot of the guides, as you know, in Antietam are doing some rehab work on McClellan. And I agree with you that he deserves a lot of criticism, including there. And he was a guy who was easy not to like. And you can read his arrogance in his letters. That doesn't mean, I mean, as Mary said earlier, for him to organize that, only McClellan could have organized that army in that brief
Yes.
period of time to fight a competent battle. If you want to criticize him for not blowing Lee out of the water, okay. But it was a miracle just to fight a competent battle that quickly coming in. And then often forgotten is that Lee did plan to go back. He wasn't fully retreating.
Right.
And McClellan kind of foiled him there. He gets very little credit for that. Very few people mention it because people don't talk about
all the people know it.
Jefferson or
I think
Williamsport.
the perception is that they leave, they cross the ford, they head back to Virginia. McClellan sits there for 6 weeks and he gets fired. That's the perception. But again, Lee wasn't done. I mean, he did come back next year, but he was going to turn around and come right back again. And when as much as you can wax poetic about McClellan about certain things, yeah, he did. I mean, the middle bridge is inexcusable for him with the U.S. regulars and Captain Dreyer and that whole part of the battle, because that's when he had Sharpsburg won, and he pulled back and he fell back because guys like Fitz-John Porter are in his ear saying, if you guys go across the bridge, we can't be defended. They're going to come right over here. But and that was not going to happen. But again, it's all in real time. I mean, he had the opportunity to go and attack Nicodemus Heights, and he chose not to because he just felt that wasn't going to be worthwhile anymore. That's a great what if. What if he does? So again, he's interesting because he's a great general manager, but his coaching is questionable. If you want to put it onto sports and certain things, right?
That's a good way to put it.
A questionable coach. I can relate to that.
Yeah.
And I like McClellan. I'm not one of these anti-McClellan guys. I just call balls and strikes the way I see them. But I think you have to look at certain things, and obviously he's got patterns. But when I look at Antietam, I imagine when they had that breakthrough at the Middle Bridge, and they were driving up, and they went all in with the Fifth Corps at that point, how that might have changed. But again, McClellan's job was to kick them out of Maryland and protect Washington and Baltimore. So he did his job. So again, hindsight being, whatever, could he have destroyed the army? Of course he could have, but in his mind, he was doing what he was supposed to do. And that's where the whole fiasco came with John Key later. If you guys remember that whole story, where he's telling the whole story that basically that the plan was never to defeat the Confederate army. The plan was to beat them on the field and not destroy them and just let basically slavery kind of fizzle out on its own. And then we had peace, and that's what got him fired eventually. But that's where all the stories come from when you read the McClellan stories, and you take with a grain of salt. Somebody does one thing, Major John Key says this, it's assumed that it came from McClellan all the way down, and we'll never know. But that's why we do history.
Absolutely.
That's why we do history.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And there's a couple of people, Scott said, this is an all-star panel. Some of my favorite Civil War historians. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for that.
That's Tom's agent.
Hal said, here, great panel. Hal also said that Colonel Allen of the 1st Maine Cavalry was provost in Frederick and handled a lot of claims from farmers. That's what he's trying to recall that. Let me just see if there's anything else here. One thing I found that I wanted to mention was the Canadian connection to Antietam, and that is the composer of the national anthem, Calixia Lavallée. I probably am butchering his name. It's a French name, and I can never say them. He is there with the 4th Rhode Island Volunteers.
Did Devin Somerville ask that question? Because
which one?
He's a Canadian who educated
No,
me
that was one I found.
Oh, okay.
I just found that randomly. I'm like,
yeah, that's great. Devin Somerville's an expert on that. He's a listener of our podcast. So.
Oh, cool.
And probably listens to your podcast too. So.
I think actually, yes, he left a comment one time.
Yeah. We talked about him when we did the Canadians in the Civil War episode.
He's Lavallée.
Yeah.
Yes, he's very.
He was when John and I were at the Antietam event in Pittsburgh in April. We did our podcast there, and Devin was there.
Good.
It was great to meet him in person.
That's so cool.
Yeah. You meet so many people through these platforms. In fact, that's how we all met, right? We didn't know
Yeah.
each other. I met Darren and Mary because of this, because of your podcast. And John and I, grew up about 10 miles apart. I'm probably 5 or 6 years older. We grew up very closely. Both worked in sports media all our careers and didn't know each other until about 2 years ago because
Oh.
of the Civil War. We had kind of parallel paths that never crossed. And our thing was, there's always fascinating way this starts. One day I just said, hey, nobody's doing a podcast on Antietam. Do you want to try? And we didn't know if there'd be a second. And now we've got 2 years. And you guys just finished your 5 year. I was at your celebration in Gettysburg.
Yeah.
Congratulations for that. You kind of set the standard for the rest of us. But it's cool to build up that audience and get those reactions and want to keep it going.
Totally.
Yeah, and for people who don't follow the Antietam Beyond podcast, I highly suggest it. I mean, these guys are great at it, and so definitely follow them. I'm sure most people here, I'm sure they do, but you never know. You never know.
I
Most
posted a link to
Americans
your
do.
podcast. I posted a link to your
Oh, that's great.
podcast, and then I
Thank you.
posted a link to your blog as well, John. So people
Oh,
know about
man.
your
That's
awesome
awesome.
blog. So
Thank you so
hopefully
much.
some people hopefully
Appreciate
some
it.
people check that out.
Oh, that's
Well,
awesome.
we are at the 1 hour mark, gentlemen. So
We start
Thanks
to
for
wind down.
having us.
Yeah. We promise these guys 1 hour because Tom's going to get to bed early. You know how he is. So, I think it's
They're
it's
still
important.
serving at the Blue and Gray Grill, Darren.
That's
I may have there.
it's
Yeah.
Wednesday. It's Thursday night.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you never know.
Yeah.
But no, but I think what's important as you study this, and one of you guys said this earlier, is people tend to look at these battles like they look at sports teams. They look at the Gettysburg people versus the Antietam people and things like that. But I think you got to remember that it's all part of campaigns. They all lead to different things. If you study Gettysburg, you'll learn a lot more about Gettysburg if you study Antietam, because there are so many parallels. Robert E. Lee, he's like Dick LeBeau, the old Steeler defensive coordinator. You guys know who he is, right? Where he does what he does. And he doesn't change it, but that's what Lee did. He liked the echelons, he liked the flank attacks, and he does it. So when you look at some of these battles, you can learn a lot about different battles by studying other ones. And in my opinion, I think Antietam is the most important battle in the war, and I've said it over and over and over again. I think when you look at the Maryland campaign, the politics that came out of it, the momentum that was stopped by McClellan and the Union, and what that led to, I don't know what happens if the Confederates win Antietam and they drive to Pennsylvania, because again, who knows how history changes. But at the end of the day, they did win that 51 to 49% victory, that little close victory on the Union side. But again, it's important because of what came afterwards. And I think people need to realize that as important as Gettysburg is and as big as Shiloh is, and they're all very important, don't get me wrong, but I think when you really boil it all down, Antietam is the hub and everything spins out of that in the East.
mhm.
I agree.
And that's why we keep chasing it. It's great to be there, and it's great to talk about. We've now done this twice in 2 weeks. We're gonna have to
Yep.
keep this up in the future. I've really enjoyed being here, Darren.
No,
Murray.
this was a great discussion. And we do have someone on here. He just commented he's tuning in a few miles from Kennesaw Mountain, so that's pretty
Ah.
cool too.
Oh, very good. Kennesaw Mountain is another
Wow.
great place when you go to these battlefields.
Yeah.
That whole Atlanta campaign, we were at Pickett's Mill, Kennesaw, Dallas, Resaca, Ringgold. There's so many great places to visit. But again, but it's great to have you guys on though, and just listening to your podcast, since you've been doing this, and it's great because you guys bring cool people on. And what's great about John and Tom is you listen to them and you're always learning something and you're always entertained, right? You don't have to be a dyed-in-the-wool Civil War nerd to appreciate it, which is really, really good. It's a good personal talk, and I think that's what I appreciate about it.
Yeah.
Good
so
stuff.
Appreciate
Thank
that.
you
Yeah.
both
love
thank you both of us, or thank you both of you for joining us tonight on
You're
this.
very
We
welcome.
definitely will-
Enjoyed it very much. The hour
Definitely
flew
will.
by.
Yeah, definitely we'll have you back again, and we definitely want to have you guys on for an episode with us too. Thank you to people who tuned in on our live stream, and this will also be available afterwards if you weren't able to tune in. Thank you for watching afterwards. But yeah, so thank you everybody, and Darren and I are not sure when we're going to be back on here for another live stream, probably in about a week or so. We'll do one. But Tom and John, thank you again. And Darren, thank you also for you guys are, I don't know much about Antietam like you guys do. I'm still-
Mary, the pleasure was all yours.
Yes, it was. Yep. Yep.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so
Great weekend.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely,
Thanks.
definitely.
Thanks
Yeah.
again for having us.
Thanks.
No,
Thanks
the-
so much.
Thanks,
Thanks
guys.